My name is Dr. Alistair Finch, and until recently, I considered myself a man of science, of tangible evidence and rational explanations. I hold a doctorate in marine biology, a field that, while often presenting nature's more peculiar wonders, rarely delves into the realm of the truly inexplicable, the kind of unsettling mystery that gnaws at the edges of sanity. My work has always been grounded in observation, in the meticulous collection of data, and the calm, objective analysis of facts. What I am about to recount, however, challenges every tenet of my lifelong dedication to logic. It has shaken the very foundations of my understanding of the world, and indeed of reality itself. My annual sabbatical often takes me to remote coastlines, seeking solace from the bustling academic world and an opportunity for uninterrupted fieldwork. This year, I chose a secluded stretch of coastline in the Pacific Northwest, a place renowned for its rugged beauty, its tempestuous weather, and its profound isolation. It was here, amidst the relentless rhythm of the tide and the mournful cries of unseen gulls, that my carefully constructed world began to unravel. The day of the discovery was unremarkable, at least initially. A thick, gray mist clung to the shoreline, a common occurrence in this region, blurring the distinction between sea and sky. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of salt and decaying kelp. I was meticulously cataloging tidal pool specimens. My focus narrowed to the tiny, resilient creatures that thrived in that harsh intertidal zone. When my boot struck something solid, yet yielding, half buried in the wet sand, it was not a piece of driftwood, nor was it one of the ubiquitous plastic containers that tragically litter even the most remote beaches. Brushing away the clinging sand and seaweed, I uncovered a book. It was a journal, or so it appeared, of a rather anachronistic design. The cover was made of a dark, heavily weathered leather, almost black in its current state, and it was bound with what looked like tarnished brass clasps. The material was waterlogged and swollen, the edges softened and frayed by its time in the sea. There were no markings on the cover, no title, no indication of its owner or origin. It felt strangely heavy in my hands, imbued with a certain solemnity, as if it held secrets best left undisturbed. My initial thoughts were practical, tinged with a professional curiosity. Perhaps it belonged to a fellow researcher, lost in a storm. Or maybe a tourist, a casualty of a capsized boat. I considered the possibility of it containing information that could lead to its owner. In a more somber scenario, to their next of kin. The ethical imperative to try and return lost property, especially something as personal as a journal, how weighed upon me. I carried it back to the small, rented cabin that served as my temporary home and laboratory. The cabin was rustic, powered by a generator, and its isolation, previously a comfort, now seemed to amplify the journal's unsettling presence. I laid it on the rough, hewn wooden table, the damp leather staining the surface. For a long while, I simply looked at it. The clasps were stiff, corroded by salt water. It took some effort and the careful use of my multi-tool to pry them open. They yielded with a reluctant groan, like a coffin lid being disturbed after a long slumber. The pages within were made of a thick, high-quality paper, yellowed and water-stained, especially around the edges. Miraculously, much of the ink, a faded, sepia-toned script, remained legible, though some passages were hopelessly blurred into abstract patterns by the seawater. The handwriting was elegant, almost calligraphic, but with a spidery, slightly erratic quality that hinted at urgency or perhaps a troubled mind. A musty, oceanic odor emanated from the open pages. A smell not just of the sea, but of something older, deeper, and infinitely more unsettling. It was a scent that seemed to carry a whisper of profound loneliness and an unnamed dread. My intention was to skim through, to find a name, an address, any clue to its provenance. But as I began to read, that detached, professional curiosity quickly gave way to a far more personal and disturbing fascination. The initial entries were mundane, almost disappointingly so. They detailed the weather, observations of seabirds, the mundane routines of someone seemingly on a solitary sea voyage. The author, whose name was not immediately apparent, wrote with a certain poetic flair, but the content was unremarkable. October 12th. One of the first legible entries began. The sea remains a mirror of gray today, reflecting the sky's somber mood. Provisions are holding well. The solitude, while vast, is not yet a burden. I find a certain peace in the endless horizon, a sense of being untethered from the world's clamor. I read on, my dinner forgotten, the generator humming its lonely tune outside. The entries were not dated by year, only by month and day, making it impossible to gauge how old the journal truly was. As I progressed, the tone began to shift, subtly at first, then with increasing alarm. The writer's observations of the sea became less about its beauty and more about its perceived emptiness, its vast indifference. October 19th. Another entry read, "The silence out here is changing. It is no longer peaceful. It feels watchful. I dismiss it as fancy, the product of too much solitude, but the feeling persists. Sometimes I imagine I hear whispers on the wind, just at the edge of hearing, too faint to discern words, but laden with a sorrow that chills me to the bone. A shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the warmth of the small wood, burning stove in the corner of the cabin. I told myself it was the evocative writing, the power of suggestion. I was a scientist after all. Whispers on the wind were simply that wind. But the entries grew stranger still. October 25th. I saw something in the water today. Not a whale, nor any known creature of the deep. It was far off, a shape that breached the surface for only a moment, too large, too unnatural. My charts show no land for hundreds of miles, no seamounts, no reefs, yet it seemed to rise from an impossible shallows. My mind must be playing tricks. The isolation is taking its toll. The writer's methodical, almost clinical descriptions of their growing unease were far more terrifying than any overt horror could have been. It was the creeping dread of a rational mind, confronting the irrational, a mind desperately trying to find logical explanations for phenomena that defied them. November 2nd. The dreams have started. They are not dreams of home or of rescue. They are dreams of the deep, of immense, crushing pressure. Of eyes that watch from the abyssal dark. Eyes that are not eyes. I wake up with my heart pounding. The scent of brine inexplicably strong in my bunk. Even though the hatches are sealed, I found myself glancing nervously towards the cabin's single window, which looked out onto the dark, tumultuous sea. The mist had thickened, pressing against the glass like a shroud. The sound of the waves seemed louder now, more insistent. The final entry I read that first night was the one that truly lodged a sliver of ice in my heart. The handwriting was noticeably more erratic here, the confident strokes of the earlier pages devolving into something hurried, almost desperate. November 10th. It is not the sea, it is in the sea. Or rather, the sea is its cloak. I have seen it again. Closer this time. It is not a creature of our world. It is ancient and vast, and it knows I am here. The whispers are clearer now. They are not sorrowful. They are hungry. I have sealed this journal in the hopes that if I am lost, someone might understand. Do not search for me. And if you value your sanity, do not search for what I have found. Some doors are best left unopened. Some depths are best left unplumbed. Below this, the page was stained with a large, irregular blotch. The ink blurred beyond recognition, as if a significant amount of water had suddenly drenched the book at that very moment. Or perhaps something else. I closed the journal, my hand trembling slightly. The cabin, my sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a fragile outpost on the edge of abyss. The scientific objectivity I prided myself on was being eroded by a primal fear, a sense of having stumbled upon a truth that humanity was perhaps not meant to know. The journal lay on the table, a sodden, leather-bound Pandora's box. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me far, more than the damp night air, that I would not sleep easily tonight. And I knew, despite the author's desperate warning, that I would have to read on. The need to understand, to uncover the rest of this terrifying narrative, had already taken root. A dark seed planted in the fertile ground of my horrified curiosity. The nightmares, I suspected, were only just beginning. The hours that followed my initial reading of the journal were fraught with an oppressive disquiet. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by fragmented images of churning black water and whispers that seemed to echo the journal writer's dread. I awoke before dawn, the gray light seeping into the cabin like an unwelcome specter. The journal lay where I had left it, its presence on the table a silent, malevolent accusation. My scientific training urged me to dismiss its contents as the ramblings of a disturbed individual, a mind unhinged by prolonged isolation, hallucinations, paranoia. These were well-documented consequences of sensory deprivation and extreme solitude at sea. And yet, the sheer conviction in the writer's words, the chillingly methodical descent from rational ovation to abject terror, resonated with a disturbing authenticity. A part of me, the pragmatic, evidence-based academic, wanted to seal the journal away, perhaps even consign it to the flames of the wood, burning stove, to treat it as an anomaly, a piece of unfortunate jetsam best forgotten. But another, more primal part A morbid curiosity intertwined with an unacknowledged fear found itself inexorably drawn back to those water-stained pages. The author's final plea: do not search for what I have found, acted not as a deterrent, but as an irresistible lure. What monstrous truth lay hidden in those depths, so terrifying that its discoverer would rather face oblivion than allow others to follow? With a fresh pot of coffee brewing, its aroma a small, comforting normality in the encroaching strangeness, I reopened the journal. The musty, oceanic scent seemed stronger now, or perhaps my senses were merely heightened by anticipation and lack of sleep. I turned past the last entry I had read, my fingers tracing the blurred inkblot, a silent testament to some unknown, terrible culmination. The next legible entry was dated November 12th, 2 days after the previous one. The handwriting was starkly different. The elegant calligraphy had completely disintegrated, replaced by a jagged, almost illegible scrawl that spoke of profound duress. Each stroke of the pen seemed to have been carved into the page with trembling force. November 12th. It showed itself, not a glimpse, not a shadow. I saw it. The storm was its herald. For 2 days, the sea has been a cauldron, waves like mountains. My little vessel tossed like a cork. I thought the tempest itself would be my end. But the storm was a distraction, a curtain raised upon a stage of cosmic horror. My own breath caught in my throat. I found myself glancing out the cabin window. The sea today was relatively calm, the morning sun beginning to burn through the mist. It was a stark contrast to the scene the journal was painting. It rose from the water during a momentary lull, when the wind held its breath and the rain paused. The sea boiled around it, not with heat, but with a displacement, as if the ocean itself was making way reluctantly. It was vast. No, a vast is too small a word. It was a geography, a mountain range of flesh and something else. Not scales, not skin as we know it. The surface of it seemed to shimmer, to shift like oil on water, but the colors were wrong, unsettling. Hues that have no name in our spectrum. I am a marine biologist. I have studied colossal squid, sperm whales, creatures of the deep that dwarf human understanding of size. But the description here, this was not biology. This was something that defied classification, something that belonged to an older, darker order of existence. And the eyes, God's the eyes! They were not on a head, for it had no discernible head, no familiar anatomy. They were everywhere. Countless, glowing orbs embedded in its shifting mass. They were the size of my ship's lifeboats, and they all turned. They all focused on me, on this insignificant speck of wood and cloth. And in their depths, I saw the age of the universe. I saw nebulae die and stars be born. I saw civilizations rise and fall on worlds I could not name. And I saw an intelligence, cold, ancient, and utterly, terrifyingly alien. I had to put the journal down. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the cabin. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter, acrid. I walked to the window, needing to see the normal, the mundane. The waves lapped gently at the shore. A flock of sandpipers skittered along the waterline. It was a world of serene, unthinking nature. How could such a world coexist with the Lovecraftian entity described in those desperate pages? But the journal beckoned. Its story was incomplete, its horror only partially unveiled. With a reluctance that was almost physical, I returned to it. It made no sound that my ears could register, yet its voice filled my mind. Not words, not language. It was a pressure, a knowing. It knew my fears. It knew my hopes. It showed me images of my home, of my family, so vivid, so real. Then it twisted them, corrupted them into scenes of unimaginable loss and despair. It was not merely threatening me. It was dissecting my soul layer by layer with an unhurried, almost curious malevolence. The writer's descent into sheer terror was palpable on the page. The ink was smudged in places, as if by frantic, sweaty hands. There were sections that were crossed out with such violence that the paper was torn. November 14th. I don't know how long I've been drifting. The engine is dead. The radio silent. It plays with me. It appears and disappears. Sometimes, a silhouette against the blood-red sunset. Sometimes closer. I feel its presence even when I cannot see it. A psychic weight that crushes my thoughts. The crew. There were 3 of us when we set out. I remember their faces, their laughter. Now I cannot recall their names. Were they ever real? Or are they just more constructs of this thing's terrible power? A chilling thought struck me. The earlier entries had been written in the first-person singular. I find a certain peace. My mind must be playing tricks. There had been no mention of a crew until this point. Was this a sign of the writer's fracturing sanity, inventing companions in their terror? Or had something happened to them? Something so horrific it was only now bleeding through the writer's mental defenses. November 15th. The whispers are constant now. They are not on the wind. They are in my head. They promise things. Release. Understanding. They say it is the guardian of a gate. A gate to other places. Other realities. They say it is ancient beyond reckoning. Older than the stars. They say it is lonely. Can something so vast, so powerful, be lonely? The thought is almost more terrifying than its hunger. The concept of a lonely, cosmic entity was a new, unsettling dimension to the horror. It painted a picture not just of a monster, but of a sentient being with motivations, however alien and incomprehensible. November 16th. I found something today. Adrift. A small, wooden crate, sealed with tar. It must have come from another vessel, lost long ago. Inside charts, but not of any ocean I know. They depict coastlines that twist in impossible geometries. Stars in unfamiliar constellations. And in the center of one chart, a symbol, a spiral with too many turns, coiling inwards to a point of utter blackness. The writer had attempted to sketch the symbol. It was a crude, shaky drawing, but there was a hypnotic quality to it, a sense of an infinitely receding depth that made my eyes ache to look at it for too long. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to replicate it, to trace its unsettling curves on a notepad I used for my own fieldwork. I resisted, a cold knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. The whispers say the chart is a key, They say the island, the impossible island I saw, it is not always there. It shifts. It moves between the folds of what we perceive as reality. They say the symbol will guide me. Guide me to what? To it. To the gate. Or to madness. The entries were becoming shorter, more fragmented. The writer's battle to maintain coherence was evident. November 18th. Food is low. Water nearly gone. It doesn't matter. The hunger I feel is not for earthly sustenance. I see it even when I close my eyes. Its form imprinted on the inside of my eyelids. The eyes, always the eyes. They know. They understand. Perhaps it is not an enemy. Perhaps it is salvation. A way out of this small, fragile existence. This shift in the writer's perception, this dawning, horrific acceptance, was perhaps the most disturbing development yet. The terror was being replaced by a kind of insane reverence. It was the psychological equivalent of a drowning. Man ceasing to struggle, surrendering to the abyss. The final entry in this section of the journal was barely a few lines. The handwriting so deteriorated, it was almost indecipherable. November 19th. The island. I see it. The spiral, it calls to me. I must go. It is waiting. It is beautiful. After that, several pages were stuck together, fused by salt and time. The ink on them was a complete blur. I tried to gently separate them, but the paper was too fragile, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. Whatever horrors or revelations lay on those were, for now, lost to me. I sat back, the cabin oppressively silent save for the distant cry of a gull and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The sun was higher now, streaming through the window, yet the cabin felt cold, shadowed. The journal had taken me on a journey into a mind unraveling, into a cosmos teeming with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. My scientific skepticism was not just eroded, it was shattered, replaced by a nascent, terrifying belief. The world outside, the world of observable phenomena and rational explanations, suddenly felt like a thin veneer, a fragile illusion stretched precariously over an abyss of unimaginable horrors. The question was no longer whether the journal was a work of fiction or a madman's ravings. The question, the one that now burned in my mind with an intensity that bordered on obsession, was what lay on those fused pages. And, more terrifyingly, had the writer reached their beautiful island? And what had they found there? I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my sabbatical was over. My research had taken an unforeseen, terrifying new direction. The journal was no longer just an object of curiosity. It was a map, and I felt an undeniable, dreadful compulsion to follow it, regardless of where it might lead. The remainder of my sabbatical was consumed by the journal. It no longer lay on the table. I had sealed it within a specimen bag, as if that could somehow contain its insidious influence. It was a futile gesture. The journal's contents had embedded themselves in my psyche, twisting my dreams into nightmarish dioramas of black, churning seas and eyes that stared from abyssal depths. The solitude I had once sought was now a fragile thing, threatened by a knowledge I desperately wished I had never unearthed. My attempts to return to my routine fieldwork were fruitless. The small marine organisms I had studied with such dedication now seemed insignificant. Trivial details in a world far vaster and more terrifying than I had ever conceived. The scientist in me warred with a rising dread, scrabbling for rational explanations for the journalist's tale. A hallucinogenic mold, perhaps, thriving in the damp confines of a decaying vessel, or a severe psychotic episode triggered by profound isolation. Yet, no matter how I reasoned, I could not shake the chilling conviction in the writer's words. The spiral symbol, the one the journalist had sketched before the entries became indecipherable, haunted me. I found myself doodling it compulsively in the margins of my field notebooks, its tortuous curves seeming to draw the eye inward, creating a faint sense of vertigo, as if peering into a bottomless chasm. It was a symbol that appeared in no maritime or archaeological lexicon I knew. It felt unnervingly ancient and palpably malevolent. The decision, when it came, was not a moment of dramatic revelation, but a slow surrender to a gnawing obsession. I could not simply walk away. I could not return to my ordinary academic life with this mystery hanging over me, unresolved. The journal was no longer just a piece of flotsam. It had become a key, a challenge to the very reality I had always accepted without question. I cut my sabbatical short, citing ill health to the university, a reason not far from the truth. The psychological toll of the journal was beginning to manifest physically. I was thinner, my eyes were shadowed, and a constant, low-level paranoia had become my companion. My colleagues, I'm sure, noticed the change, but I dared not confide the true reason. They would think me mad. Perhaps I was. My first act upon returning to my university office, a sanctuary of books and marine specimens, was to attempt the separation of the journal's fused pages. I worked with meticulous care, employing tools normally reserved for the most delicate dissections. The process was painstaking, lasting hours, each slowly revealed surface causing my heart to thrum with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Unfortunately, the salt water had done its work too well. Only fragmented words and phrases remained legible. O architecture not of this earth, a song that bends the mind, they do not die, and, most chillingly, a crude sketch of what appeared to be a section of the island the journal writer had described: a black, unnaturally twisted spire, monolithic and malevolent, soaring into a dark, roiling sky. Even as a rough drawing, it conveyed a sense of terrifying scale and antiquity. My next focus was the chart the writer claimed to have found in the drifting crate. I scrutinized the details of the spiral symbol again, the descriptions of unfamiliar constellations and warped coastlines. As a marine biologist, I had a working knowledge of ocean currents and drift patterns. I began feeding the data from the journal the writer's last known approximate position, F, before their communication ceased, descriptions of the violent weather. However, and the estimated time the journal might been adrift into sophisticated computer models. The results were both startling and deeply unsettling. The models pointed to a remote region of the South Pacific, an area notorious for unpredictable storms and a long history of mysterious maritime disappearances. It was a patch of ocean rarely traversed by commercial shipping lanes and largely unexplored by scientific expeditions. Current nautical charts showed only open ocean, no islands, no reefs, nothing to indicate any anomaly. Yet, when I overlaid the journal's sketch of the warped coastline onto satellite imagery of the region, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. On certain high-resolution satellite passes, taken during rare windows of clear weather, there was a faintness, a submerged shadow, its shaping consistent with known undersea geology. It was ephemeral, indistinct, yet chillingly reminiscent of the distorted outlines in the journal's drawing. As if the island existed, but predominantly beneath the waves. Or perhaps, as the journal suggested, it appeared and disappeared. I began researching the myths and folklore of the island chains closest to the indicated region. In archaic oral traditions, passed down through generations, there were mentions of phantom islands or moving islands that would appear to unfortunate mariners only to lead them to ruin or madness. These tales often spoke of alluring songs or whispers, and of terrible beings that inhabited these ephemeral lands. Academics had largely dismissed these as mere legends, but with the journal in my hands, they took on the grim resonance of warnings. I made discreet inquiries with a colleague, Dr. Amelia Van Horn, a marine geologist specializing in unusual bathymetric features. I didn't reveal the journal, merely asked about the possibility of unmapped, significant undersea structures in that particular region. She was skeptical, but conceded that the ocean still held vast mysteries, and new discoveries were always possible. She even mentioned some anomalous seismic readings from that area years ago, dismissed at the time as inconclusive. Each piece of evidence, however, slight and circumstantial on its own, began to coalesce into a disturbing picture. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, a terrifying pattern that pointed to the possibility that the journal writer's account was not mere fantasy. The obsession to find out was becoming all-consuming. I knew that what I was contemplating was beyond the pale of accepted science. It was a step into the territory of the deranged, an expedition to find an island that might not exist, to confront what could very well be a figment of a tortured mind. Nevertheless, I began to make preparations. I researched routes, chartered a small but robust sea-worthy vessel, and gathered supplies and scientific equipment, some necessary, some merely for a sense of preparedness. I told myself it was simply an unusually challenging field expedition, a chance to investigate an intriguing geological anomaly. But deep down, I knew what I was doing. I was heeding the journal writer's final, unspoken plea. I was going to search for what they had found. As my preparations neared completion, I read the journal one last time. The writer's words seemed to echo in my quiet office, no longer as a narrative, but as a prophecy. Some doors are best left unopened. Some depths are best left unplumbed. I didn't know what door I was about to open, or what depths I was about to plumb. But I knew I could no longer turn back. The journal had bound my fate to that of its author, and whatever awaited me at that impossible island, I had to see it through. My own voyage was just beginning, and a new, colder wave of dread began to wash over me, a fear of what I might find, and what, in turn, might find me. The voyage to the coordinates, pinpointed by my research and the journal's fragmented clues, was an ordeal in itself. The chartered vessel, the Sea Serpent, was sturdy, as promised. But the ocean in this remote stretch of the Pacific was a capricious beast. Days of unnerving, glassy calm would suddenly give way to violent squalls that tossed the boat about like a child's toy. My crew, a pair of taciturn, weathered islanders named Kai and Manu, were skilled sailors, their faces betraying little emotion, even as mountainous waves crashed over the bow. They knew these waters, or at least the edges of them. When I had shown them the charts, my conventional nautical charts, not the unsettling ones from the journal, and indicated our destination, a flicker of something unreadable had passed between them. They asked no questions, a silence I found more unnerving than any protest. As we drew closer to the target area, a peculiar sense of anticipation settled over the Sea Serpent. The air grew heavy, humid, and an unnatural stillness fell upon the water. The usual cacophony of seabirds dwindled, then ceased altogether. Even Kai and Manu seemed affected, their usual quiet, watchfulness tinged with a new tension. The electronic navigation systems began to behave erratically, the GPS flickering, the depth sounder returning impossible reading. Eggs or none at all. We were forced to rely on older methods: sextant, compass, and dead reckoning, skills I was thankful I maintained from my earlier fieldwork. It was on the 5th day in the target zone, under a bruised, purple sky that threatened a storm yet held its breath, that Manu, his voice a low rumble, pointed to the horizon. Land, he said, though the word seemed inadequate. It was not land as I knew it. Rising from the steely gray water was a series of black, needle-like spires, their surfaces slick and non-reflective, like obsidian or wet basalt. They were grotesquely twisted, defying geological norms, piercing the sky at unnatural angles. There was no sign of vegetation, no sandy beaches, only these stark, menacing monoliths. And at their center, veiled in a shimmering heat like haze, was a larger, more massive structure, the spire from the journal's crude sketch. Though the drawing had done no justice to its horrifying scale and alien geometry, it seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly, greenish, yellow glow that was profoundly unsettling. As we navigated cautiously closer, a low, throbbing hum began to permeate the air, a sound felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It resonated with the hull of the Sea Serpent, setting my teeth on edge. This, I realized with a jolt of icy dread, must be the journal writer had mentioned a vibration that didn't just bend the mind, but seemed to warp the very fabric of perception. Strange, fleeting images flickered at the periphery of my vision, impossible colors, shifting landscapes, faces that were almost human, but hideously distorted. I fought to maintain my composure, my scientific objectivity, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with cupped hands. Kai and Manu were visibly distressed now. Their dark skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and they muttered to each other in their native tongue. Words I could not understand, but whose fearful cadence was unmistakable. I ordered them to anchor a safe distance from the island, if island was the correct term for this nightmarish outcrop. I would proceed alone in the ship's small inflatable dinghy. They did not argue, their relief palpable. The water around the island was unnaturally dark, almost black, and disturbingly placid, despite the low hum that vibrated through it. As I rowed closer, the air grew colder, imbued with the same ancient, briny, and unsettlingly organic scent that had clung to the journal. The spires loomed over me, their scale dwarfing my small craft. The silence, save for the thrumming and the dip of my oars, was absolute and terrifying. I found a small, narrow inlet between two of the smaller spires, a dark chasm that seemed to lead into the island's interior. The water here was shallow, revealing a seabed not of sand or rock, but of something that looked disturbingly like compacted, fossilized organic matter, patterned with the same unsettling spiral motif I had seen in the journal. My hand, gripping the oar, trembled uncontrollably. Securing the dinghy, I stepped onto the shore. The ground beneath my boots was strangely resilient, like hardened rubber, and it too bore the faint, spiral patterns. The air was thick, difficult to breathe, and the thrumming intensified, now accompanied by faint, sibilant whispers that seemed to slither around the edges of my hearing. They were not in any language I recognized, yet they conveyed a sense of immense age, of vast, alien intellect, and of a profound, chilling hunger. I had brought a small kit with me, a flashlight, a geological hammer, sample bags, my camera, and, tucked into my belt, a heavy flare gun, a flimsy defense. I knew, against whatever horrors this place might hold, but a small comfort nonetheless. The passage wound inwards, away from the oppressive light of the bruised sky, into a gloom that my flashlight beam struggled to penetrate. The walls of the passage were not rock in any conventional sense. They were a dark, veined material, slightly yielding to the touch, like hardened cartilage. And embedded within them, at irregular intervals, were things. At first, I thought they were unusually shaped mineral concretions. But as I drew closer, flashlight beam wavering, I saw they were organic. Or at least they had once been. They were creatures, or parts of creatures, encased in the island's substance, their forms twisted into expressions of unimaginable agony or ecstasy. Some were vaguely piscine, others disturbingly arthropodal, and some were unclassifiable, nightmarish amalgams of limbs, eyes, and orifices that defied any biological precedent. They were not fossils in the traditional sense. They seemed to be absorbed, incorporated into the very being of the island. They do not die, the journal fragment had whispered. My stomach churned. The scientific curiosity that had driven me this far was being rapidly overwhelmed by a primal, visceral terror. I took photographs, my hands shaking so badly the images would likely be blurred. I chipped off a small sample of the wall with my hammer. It came away with a wet, tearing sound, and the freshly exposed surface beneath seemed to glisten, almost to breathe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, coiling around my thoughts, promising knowledge, power, an end to the insignificant anxieties of human existence. They spoke of the gate, of the old ones who slept beyond it, and of the guardian that kept watch, the entity the journal writer had seen, the mountainous flesh and eye, thing that was the island itself or its master. I pressed on, driven by a compulsion that was no longer my own. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber, dimly illuminated by the same sickly greenish, yellow light that emanated from the central spire, which I could now see towered above, its peak lost in the oppressive darkness of the cavern roof. And in the center of the chamber, on a raised dais of the same spiraled, organic material, lay the source of the light. It was not a geological feature. It was an egg, or something akin to an egg. It was immense, easily the size of a small house, ovoid and translucent, its surface veined with pulsating, dark arteries. And within it, suspended in a luminous, amniotic fluid, was a shape. A fetal, colossal form curled upon itself. I could see a multitude of nascent limbs, the suggestion of forming eyes, countless and lidless, and a vast, slowly beating heart that was the source of the thrumming that filled the air in my mind. It was gestating. The guardian, or perhaps a sign of it, was being born, or reborn. The whispers reached a crescendo, no longer seductive, but demanding, exultant. They urged me forward, to touch the egg, to become part of the glorious, terrible process. My sanity was a frayed thread. I could feel my will dissolving, my identity being subsumed by the overwhelming, psychic presence of this place, this entity. It was then, as I took a stumbling step forward, that my foot struck something. I looked down. It was a skeleton, human, clad in the tattered remnants of what looked like an old-fashioned oilskin coat. And clutched in its bony fingers was a small, leather-bound water-stained journal. The shock of recognition, so potent, so absolute, was like a physical blow. It was him, the writer. He had reached his beautiful island. He had come to this very chamber, and he had become another offering, another absorbed piece of the island's horrific tapestry. That realization, the stark, undeniable fate of my predecessor, was what saved me. It shattered the psychic hold, the horrifying allure. Revulsion and a desperate, animalistic need to survive surged through me. I turned and fled. I didn't look back at the pulsating egg, at the whispers that now shrieked with fury and frustration. I scrambled through the dark passage, past the entombed horrors in the walls, their silent screams echoing in my mind. I burst out into the bruised daylight, the thrumming of the island a physical pressure at my back. I threw myself into the dinghy, rowing with a strength born of sheer terror, not caring about the direction, only needing to put distance between myself and that abomination. The sea serpent, Kai, and Manu were a beacon of blessed normality in a world that had tilted on its axis. As they hauled me aboard, as we turned the ship and fled that accursed place, I risked one last look back. The shimmering haze around the central spire seemed to intensify, and for a horrifying instant, I thought I saw it move. A colossal shifting, as if something immense was stirring within or beneath. And from the peak of the spire, a single, vast, leadless eye, glowing with that same sickly green light, seemed to open and fix its gaze upon our fleeing vessel. I didn't sleep for days. The nightmares, when exhaustion finally claimed me, are beyond description. What I read in that journal will indeed give me nightmares for the rest of my life. But what I saw, what I experienced on that island, that has scarred something deeper than my mind. It has scarred my soul. I have the samples. I have the photographs, blurred as they are. I even have the second journal, its pages even more ravaged by time and the elements than the first. I am a scientist. I should analyze them, publish my findings, warn the world. But how can I? Who would believe me? And more importantly, do I dare draw the attention of that thing to our world again? Some doors are best left unopened. Some depths are best left unplumbed. I know that now. I know it with a certainty that chills me to the very marrow of my bones. And I know that somewhere, in the remote vastness of the South Pacific, an island of impossible geometry, an unspeakable horror waits, and an ancient, malevolent intelligence slumbers, gestates, and perhaps watches.